A recruiter once looked me dead in the eye and told me I was too old to start over. Not unemployable, not unqualified, just too old. I was 50 years old, 22 years into the only job I'd ever really known. And in less time than it takes to read a layoff letter, all of it was gone. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for almost an hour before I trusted myself to drive home and tell my wife. I didn't have a plan that day. No backup career. No side hustle quietly growing in the background. No cushion. What I had was a toolbox gathering dust in the garage, a wife who hadn't seen me scared in 26 years of marriage, and a feeling in my chest I didn't have a name for yet. This year, 5 years after that conversation in a recruiter's office, the business I built from nothing crossed 7 figures. Not because someone finally believed in me, because I stopped waiting for someone to. Here's what happened in between. For 22 years, I knew exactly who I was. I was the guy at Castor Manufacturing who could walk into a jammed production line, listen to it for 10 seconds, and tell you exactly which bearing was about to go. I started on the floor at 28, swinging a wrench for $11 an hour, and worked my way up to maintenance supervisor over 2 decades of double shifts, missed birthdays, and enough overtime to put a roof over my family's heads without ever really thinking about it. That job wasn't just a paycheck. It was the answer to every question about who I was. Ask me at a barbecue what I did, and I didn't say, I work at a plant. I said, I'm a Castor man, like it was a bloodline. Diane used to tease me about it. She'd say I loved that plant more than I loved my recliner, and for 22 years, she wasn't entirely wrong. We bought our house because of that job. We put Jake through Little League and Becca through dance lessons because of that job. Every Friday at 3:45, the same 5 guys and I would grab a beer at Larry's and complain about management. And underneath the complaining, every one of us was grateful. We had something steady in a world that wasn't always steady. I figured I'd retire from that plant. I figured they'd give me a watch and a handshake, and I'd spend my last years teaching some kid half my age how to listen to a machine the way I could. Then the rumors started. Whispers about the parent company moving production south, about restructuring, about a new ownership group that talked in numbers instead of names. I told myself it wouldn't touch me. 22 years. I'd trained half the floor. I was the guy they called at 2 a.m. when something broke that nobody else could fix. Surely that counted for something. It didn't. They called me into a small office on a Tuesday morning in March. Not even my actual office. A borrowed conference room with a folder already printed and waiting on the table. A woman from corporate HR I'd never met before slid the folder toward me and used the word transition 4 times in 2 minutes. I don't remember much of what she said after that. I remember the folder had my name spelled with one too many L's. 22 years, and they couldn't even spell it right. I walked back to my station to collect my things while half the floor pretended not to watch. Guys I'd trained. Guys whose kids I'd watched grow up in company picnic photos. Nobody said anything, because nobody knew what to say to a man whose whole identity had just been put in a cardboard box. I carried that box to my truck, sat behind the wheel in the parking lot I'd parked in for over 2 decades, and for the first time since I was 28 years old, I had absolutely no idea who I was supposed to be on Monday morning. That night, I sat at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours before Diane came home from running errands and found me still in my work boots, the box from the plant unopened by the door. I told her everything in about 4 sentences, the way men do when we're trying to keep our voice steady. She didn't cry. She just walked over, put both hands on my shoulders, and said, "Okay, we'll figure it out." Jake, 19 at the time, came downstairs hearing the quiet and asked what was wrong before he'd even fully woken up. I remember telling him and watching something shift in his face. Not fear exactly, more like the moment a kid realizes his father is not, in fact, indestructible. Becca was 14, old enough to sense the tension in the house for weeks afterward without anyone explaining why. The first few weeks, I wasn't worried. I had 22 years of experience, a spotless record, and references who'd vouch for me without blinking. I updated my resume at the kitchen table, printed 40 copies at the library because our printer was out of ink, and started applying to every maintenance and operations role within an hour of our house. I figured it would take a month, maybe 6 weeks if I was being honest with myself. 3 months later, I'd sent out over 100 applications and had exactly 6 interviews to show for it. In 4 of those 6, I noticed the same thing before anyone said a word. I was easily the oldest person in the waiting room, sometimes by 20 years, sitting across from interviewers young enough to be my kids, watching their eyes flick down to my graduation date on the resume and then back up at my face, doing the math. Nobody said, "You're too old," directly. They said things like, "We're looking for someone who can grow with us long term," or "We want someone who'll really mesh with our culture," said while glancing at my gray hair like it was a liability. One HR woman actually told me, with a straight face, that I seemed incredibly overqualified for a job paying $11 less than what I'd made 20 years earlier. Then there was Trent. Trent was a recruiter at a staffing agency a friend recommended, maybe 30 years old, wearing a watch that cost more than my truck payment. I sat across from his desk with my folder of references and my 22 years of experience laid out like proof of something, and he looked at me, not unkindly, almost like he was doing me a favor, and said, "Honestly, at your age, starting over in this market isn't realistic. Companies want runway. They want someone they can shape for the next 20 years, not someone already at the finish line." The finish line, like my life, was a clock running out instead of a man sitting 15 feet away from him, still breathing, still capable, still needing to pay a mortgage. I drove home that day and didn't tell Diane what he'd said, not because I was protecting her, because I didn't trust my own voice to say it out loud without it cracking. I started avoiding the grocery store on the days I knew old co-workers shopped. I stopped going to Larry's on Fridays. The unemployment check that showed up every 2 weeks felt less like help and more like a verdict, stamped and mailed, confirming what Trent had already told me to my face. I started doing things I never imagined having to do at 50. I took the graduation date off my resume, hoping it would buy me a phone call before age entered the conversation. A friend suggested I dye the gray out of my beard before interviews, and I actually considered it for a full day before deciding I wasn't going to disappear myself just to get past a screening algorithm. I learned what it felt like to submit an application into an online portal and watch it vanish into a system that, as far as I could tell, no human being ever actually read. No confirmation, no rejection, just silence, over and over, dozens of times a week. The hardest part wasn't even the rejections. It was watching former coworkers from Castor post new jobs on LinkedIn within weeks of the layoff. Men with half my experience landing roles I'd applied for and never heard back from. I started avoiding that app too, the way I avoided the grocery store, the way I avoided Larry's. I was running out of places I could go without being reminded of what I no longer had. By month 5, our savings had gone from a comfortable cushion to a number that kept me awake doing math at 3 a.m. I'd lie there next to Diane, who I knew was awake too, both of us pretending to sleep so the other wouldn't worry, running the mortgage and the car payment and Becca's last semester of community college through my head like a rosary that never gave me peace. I started snapping at things that didn't deserve it. Jake left a cabinet door open and I lectured him for 10 minutes about responsibility, when really I was just ashamed that my 19-year-old son had picked up more part-time shifts that month than I'd been offered job interviews. Diane never once complained about money in front of me. She just quietly stopped buying the coffee she liked and started making it at home, and I noticed, and I said nothing, because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't make it worse. The worst day came at Becca's spring recital. I was sitting in a folding chair in a school gymnasium that smelled like floor wax, watching my daughter do something she loved, and my phone buzzed in my pocket. A rejection email. Polite. Generic. "We've decided to move forward with other candidates." I read it during her performance, sitting in the dark, and felt something in me go quiet in a way that scared me more than the words on the screen. Not anger. Just a flat, gray nothing. Like I'd stopped expecting anything else. I started skipping the job board some mornings entirely, not because I'd given up exactly, but because I couldn't stomach reading entry level attached to jobs that paid less than I'd made at 28. I'd sit in the garage instead, the same garage with the toolbox I hadn't opened in months, and just stare at it. Not working, not fixing anything, just sitting with a version of myself I didn't recognize. A man who used to be the guy everyone called when something broke, now unable to fix the one thing that was actually broken, which was his own sense of who he was without a badge and a time clock. I lost 11 pounds that spring without trying, the kind of weight loss that comes from a stomach too knotted to hold a real meal. I started getting headaches behind my left eye most afternoons, the kind I'd never had in 22 years of physical labor at the plant. I went to the unemployment office downtown every 2 weeks to file my claim, sitting in a row of plastic chairs with men 20 and 30 years younger than me, all of us avoiding eye contact, all of us carrying some version of the same silence. Our neighbor's son, 23 years old, got laid off from a warehouse job the same month I lost mine, and had a new position within 3 weeks. Diane mentioned it once, not as a comparison, just as conversation, and I felt something in my chest tighten that I wasn't proud of, not anger at him, just at the math of it, the math that seemed to say a 23-year-old's unemployment was a temporary inconvenience, and mine was a life sentence. Diane found me out there one night, past 11, the garage light buzzing overhead. I told her exactly that. I said, I think this might just be it. I think I might be done. She didn't flinch. She just sat down on the cold concrete next to me in her robe, leaned her head on my shoulder, and after a long quiet, said, You're still the man I married. That job was never the whole of you. Not on my watch. I didn't believe her that night, but I didn't forget it either. The turn started with something small enough that I almost missed it. Jim, my neighbor of 15 years, caught me in the driveway on a Saturday morning and asked if I knew anything about fixing a sagging deck post. Before the plant, before any of this, my father had been a carpenter, a real one, the kind who built half the porches in our old neighborhood with his own hands, and who tried for years to teach me the trade before I chose the steady paycheck at Castor instead. I told Jim I'd take a look, mostly to get out of the house. It took me 4 hours, half a tube of construction adhesive, and a trip to the hardware store I hadn't visited in years. When I was done, that deck post was sturdier than it had been since the day it went in. Jim handed me $60 and a beer and said something I hadn't heard directed at me in 5 months. You're really good at this. I drove home that day feeling something I didn't have a name for. Not pride exactly. More like recognition, like running into an old friend you'd forgotten you missed. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying it. Not the $60. The feeling of being useful with my hands again. The way I'd felt my whole life before a folder with my name misspelled on it decided I wasn't useful anymore. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like ours. Within 2 weeks, Jim's sister-in-law needed a fence panel replaced. A guy from my old street needed a door rehung. None of it was big. None of it paid real money. But every single time, I noticed something. Nobody in that exchange asked how old I was. Nobody glanced at a graduation date. They just needed something fixed, and I could fix it. And that was the entire conversation. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with Diane, going over what was left in our savings. Not much, maybe 2 months if we were careful. And instead of opening another job board, I opened a blank page. I wrote down every odd job I'd done in the past month. I wrote down what my father used to charge, adjusted for 30 years of inflation. And I wrote down a sentence that scared me more than any rejection letter had. What if I stopped trying to convince someone to hire me and just started being the guy people already call? My father had offered, more than once over the years, to teach me everything he knew before he passed. How to read a board for warping, how to set a hinge so a door never sagged, how to charge a fair price without shortchanging yourself. I'd waved him off every time, certain that a factory job with benefits and a pension was the smarter bet for a young man with a family on the way. Looking back, I don't regret 22 years at Castor, but I'd spent half my life assuming my father's trade was a fallback instead of recognizing it for what it actually was, a skill nobody could lay off, outsource, or hand to a folder with the wrong spelling of my name. Within a month of Jim's deck, I'd done 6 more small jobs, all word of mouth, all for people who lived within a 10-minute drive of our house. None of them knew or cared that I'd spent 2 decades at a plant. They just needed something fixed, and somehow, that simple fact felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in half a year. Diane read that sentence twice. Then she looked up at me and said, "So stop sending out resumes. Start sending out flyers." I didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time in 5 months, it wasn't because I was afraid. It was because some part of me, quietly, had already decided. Starting a business when you're 50 and broke doesn't look like the version you see in movies. There's no investor meeting, no pitch deck, no dramatic music. It looked like me, on a Tuesday afternoon, clearing 20 years of accumulated junk out of our garage to make room for a folding table, and using the very last of our emergency fund to buy a decent set of tools at the hardware store, because the ones I owned were my father's, older than my marriage, and half of them no longer held an edge. I put $200 I genuinely couldn't spare onto a credit card that week. I remember standing at the register, feeling the same flat fear I'd felt at every job rejection, except this time it was pointed at myself instead of at some interviewer's judgment. If this didn't work, there'd be no one else to blame. Diane helped me design a flyer on her laptop. Nothing fancy, just my name, a phone number, and the words "Honest Home Repairs," fair prices, no job too small. And we posted it in 3 neighborhood Facebook groups and stapled it to the bulletin board at the grocery store I'd been avoiding for months. I drove my old truck to the sign shop and paid $40 to have Mitchell Home Solutions lettered crooked across both doors because I couldn't afford to redo it when the first attempt came out slightly off-center. I almost didn't put it up at all. 22 years of being a guy with a badge and a title, and now my name was on the side of a truck doing handyman work, visible to every single person who'd known me as something else. That fear was real, and I won't pretend it wasn't. I ran into an old Castor coworker at the gas station that first week, and when he asked what I was up to, I almost lied. I almost said I was between opportunities, the way I had for months. Instead, for the first time, I told him the truth. I started my own thing. Home repairs. He looked at the truck, looked at me, and said, "Good for you, man. Better than waiting on them to call you back." It was such a small sentence, but I drove away from that gas station feeling 10 pounds lighter. Diane was proud and terrified in equal measure, and she never hid either feeling from me. She believed in the work. She wasn't always sure the timing made sense, with 2 months of savings left and a daughter's tuition due. But she signed the flyer with me. She drove around town helping me staple it up. And on the night before my very first paying job outside our own neighborhood, she squeezed my hand across the kitchen table and said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, you already did the hard part. You started." Jake's reaction surprised me. I expected some embarrassment, a 19-year-old not exactly thrilled to tell his friends his father was now doing handyman work around the neighborhood. Instead, he showed up that first weekend without being asked, helped me load the truck, and said, "This is kind of badass, actually, Dad. You're starting your own thing." Becca, 14 and characteristically blunt, asked if this meant we were poor now. I told her the truth, that we were tighter than we'd ever been, but that this was me trying to fix that, not make it worse. She seemed to accept that answer better than I expected her to. I spent that first week rehearsing, out loud, alone in the garage, how I'd answer the phone. "Mitchell Home Solutions, this is Tom." I must have said it 40 times before the first real call came in, my hands actually shaking a little when the phone finally rang. My first real job outside the neighborhood came from a man named Pete, a friend of Jim's, who needed his upstairs bathroom gutted and redone on a budget. I quoted him a price that, looking back, was almost insulting to myself. $1,800 for labor on a job that should have been closer to $3,000, because I was terrified that if I charged what it was worth, he'd just hire someone younger and cheaper instead. That job took me 11 days, most of them stretching past midnight, because I was still learning how long things actually take when you're the only person doing the demo, the plumbing, the tile, and the cleanup. I came home every night smelling like grout and exhaustion, my knees aching in a way they never had on the factory floor, and Diane would have dinner waiting even at 11:30, never once complaining about the hour. Pete loved the finished bathroom. He told 3 neighbors. But 2 weeks after I finished, a different client, a referral from a Facebook group, a small deck repair, handed me a check that bounced, and when I called to sort it out, he stopped answering his phone entirely. $240, gone, along with the supplies I'd already paid for out of pocket. It doesn't sound like much money to lose now. At the time, it felt like the floor giving out beneath a foundation that was already shaking. I remember sitting in the truck outside that man's house, the engine running, seriously considering calling every job board I'd given up on and begging for whatever was left. I'd proven I could still swing a hammer. I hadn't proven I could run a business, and that bounce check felt like confirmation of every doubt Trent the recruiter had planted in me months earlier. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe 50 was too old to learn an entirely new set of rules. I came home that night and told Diane I was thinking about quitting, about going back to applying for warehouse jobs, anything with a guaranteed paycheck. She didn't argue with me right away. She let me finish, let the silence sit for a second, and then she asked one question. Did the work you actually did, the bathroom, the deck before that one, was it good work? I said yes. It was the best work I'd done in years. She nodded and said, then the work isn't the problem. You just haven't learned the business part yet. Nobody does, on day one of anything. That sentence didn't fix the bounce check. It didn't pay for the lumber I'd already lost. But it gave me something to do with the failure besides quit, learn from it. I started asking for half payment up front on every job after that. Small thing. It changed everything. Pete walked through that bathroom on the final day, running his hand along the new tile, and didn't say much at first, which worried me until he turned around and said, I've had 3 contractors out to this house over the years. You're the first one who actually finished what he said he'd finish, when he said he'd finish it. I held on to that sentence longer than I probably should have, replaying it on nights when doubt crept back in. The bounce check came from a man 2 streets over who'd seemed perfectly normal, friendly, paid the deposit on time, even offered me a glass of water while I worked. When his check bounced and his phone call stopped, Diane wanted me to take him to small claims court over it. I almost did. In the end, I let it go, mostly because I didn't have the time or the stomach for a fight over $240 when I had 3 other jobs waiting that week. Sue would later tell me that letting it go was the wrong business decision and the right decision for my sanity, and that sometimes those 2 things don't match. Something shifted after that bathroom job, slow enough that I almost didn't notice it happening. Pete left me a review on the local Facebook group, 5 stars, with photos, calling me the most honest contractor I've dealt with in this town. That single post brought me 4 phone calls in 1 week. Not because I'd advertised, because a stranger trusted another stranger's word over anything I could have said about myself. I started keeping a small notebook in my truck, 1 page per client, tracking what worked and what didn't. I learned to ask better questions before quoting a price. How old the pipes were, whether the deck had water damage I couldn't see from the surface, whether a client wanted the cheapest fix or the right fix. I learned the difference between a customer who wanted a relationship and one who just wanted a transaction, and I learned to charge accordingly, no longer apologizing for the number I gave. By month 4 of the business, I wasn't taking every job that came in anymore. I remember the exact moment that shifted something in me. A woman called wanting a same-day fix for a leaking faucet, irritated that I couldn't drop everything. And I heard myself say, calmly, I'm booked through Thursday, but I can get you in Friday morning if that works. I hung up the phone and sat in the garage for a minute, stunned by my own sentence. 5 months earlier, I'd have driven across town at 9 p.m. for any job, any price, terrified of losing the only opportunity one had. Now I had a schedule. I had a waiting list. I had, for the first time since the layoff, something that felt like leverage instead of desperation. The neighborhood Facebook groups became my biggest source of work, but so did something I hadn't expected: other tradespeople. An electrician named Gary, who I'd met haggling over supplies at the hardware store, started sending me jobs his crew was too busy for, and I returned the favor whenever a client needed wiring done right. A plumber 2 towns over did the same. None of us were competitors in the way I'd assumed every business relationship had to be. We were just guys trying to build something steady, and steady people recognize each other. Diane noticed the change before I said anything about it. She found me one evening actually whistling while I cleaned grout off a tile saw in the garage, something she said she hadn't heard from me since before the layoff. You sound like yourself again, she said. I didn't fully understand what she meant until later, but she was right. I wasn't just making money. I was becoming, slowly, someone I recognized in the mirror again. Gary the electrician and I started grabbing coffee some Tuesday mornings before either of our days got busy, comparing notes on difficult clients and fair pricing, 2 men who'd both started over in their own way. He'd lost his job to a corporate buyout in his 40s and built his own crew from nothing. And talking to him made me realize I wasn't the only 50-something in town quietly rebuilding a life that someone else had decided was over. By that point, I'd also started turning small jobs into bigger ones simply by asking the right question at the end of a visit. While I'm here, is there anything else that's been bothering you about the house? Half the time, the answer led to a second project. I wasn't trying to upsell anyone. I'd just learned that most homeowners carry a mental list of things they've quietly given up on fixing, and being the person who finally asks about that list builds more trust than any advertisement could. By the end of the first year, I had more work than 2 hands could keep up with, and a decision in front of me I hadn't expected to face this soon: hire someone or start turning away money I genuinely needed. I'd met Marcus on a job site, a 26-year-old who'd been laid off himself from a construction company that folded during a slow season. Sharp, hardworking, but a little lost in the way I recognized from my own mirror 18 months earlier. I brought him on for a trial week, expecting to train him the way someone trains an employee. What actually happened felt more like the way my father had trained me: patient, specific, correcting his grip on a drill the same way Dad used to correct mine. Except now I was the one doing the teaching, and something about that loop closing meant more to me than I expected it to. Hiring Marcus forced me to get serious about things I'd been putting off. I finally paid for the full contractor's license and liability insurance I'd been operating without a proper safety net for, because I could no longer tell myself it was just me taking the risk. I hired an accountant, a sharp woman named Sue, who looked at my shoebox of receipts and laughed before sitting me down and teaching me, patiently, how to actually read a profit and loss statement. I learned the hardest lesson of running a business. The work you're good at and the business you're building are not the same skill, and ignoring the second one will sink the first one eventually. There were real growing pains. I lost a few days of work training Marcus that I could have spent earning. I had to let go of a second hire after 6 weeks when his work simply wasn't up to the standard I'd built my name on. A hard conversation, made harder by the fact that I knew exactly what it felt like to be let go, and I hated being on the other side of that table. But I also learned that protecting my name mattered more than filling a schedule, and that lesson alone saved the business more than once down the road. Diane watched all of this from close enough to see the toll, but far enough to let me carry it myself. One night, going over numbers at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once done math on dwindling savings at 3 a.m., I looked up and realized we were doing math on growth instead of survival. Different numbers. Different kind of sleepless. I told her that, and she just smiled and said, I'll take this kind of tired any day. So would I? Marcus had a young daughter of his own, and he told me once, on a lunch break sitting on the tailgate of my truck, that he'd almost given up on the trades entirely after his layoff, applying for warehouse jobs out of the same desperation I recognized too well. I didn't plan to tell him my own story that day, but I did, the whole thing, Trent's office and all, and he just nodded slowly and said, Guess we found each other at the right time then. The second hire, a guy named Dale, was a harder story. He was likable, showed up on time, but his cuts were sloppy and his measurements were consistently off in ways that meant redoing work after he left the site. I gave him 3 separate chances to correct it, more than I probably should have, because some part of me kept thinking about how it felt to be judged and discarded too quickly. When I finally let him go, I drove home and sat in the truck in our own driveway for 10 minutes, the same way I had outside Trent's office. Except this time, I was the one who'd had to say the hard thing to someone else's face. I understood, in a new way, how much that conversation cost the person delivering it to. 5 years after that conversation in Trent's office, Mitchell Home Solutions isn't a man with a truck and a borrowed ladder anymore. We run 3 crews. We've got a real shop space we lease on the edge of town, with a sign out front that isn't crooked, because this time I paid a professional to letter it. We do full kitchen and bathroom remodels now, additions, the kind of work that takes weeks instead of days, the kind of work that requires permits and inspectors, and a level of trust one never once imagined a stranger handing to a 50-something guy with a hand-painted truck 5 years earlier. This year, when Sue sat across from me at her office with the year-end numbers, she turned the laptop around so I could see it myself instead of just telling me. 7 figures. Gross revenue, not profit, she was careful to remind me, because Sue is exactly that precise. But still, 7 figures, built by a man who, 5 years earlier, had 2 months of savings left and a recruiter's voice telling him the door was closed for good. I want to be honest about something, because I think honesty is the only part of this story worth telling. The number on that screen didn't feel the way I thought it would. I didn't pump my fist. I didn't call anyone right away. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of Sue's office, a different parking lot than the one where Trent told me I was too old, but the same kind of quiet. And I just sat there for a while, the same way I had 5 years before, except this time the silence wasn't dread. It was something closer to disbelief, mixed with a grief I didn't expect, for the version of myself who almost gave up in that garage, who almost called the warehouse after the bounce check, who almost believed Trent was right. What actually changed wasn't the bank account, even though the bank account changed plenty. What changed was something Jake said to me at dinner a few months back, almost in passing, not realizing how much weight the sentence carried. Dad, you're the most relentless person I know. My son is 24 now. He doesn't remember the version of me that walked out of Castor with a cardboard box. He only knows the version that built something from nothing, twice. Once with my hands, and once with whatever it is that makes a man get up the next morning anyway. That sentence is worth more to me than the number on Sue's screen, and I mean that without a shred of exaggeration. The jobs themselves changed shape entirely over those 5 years. We went from a $60 deck repair to a $40,000 kitchen remodel for a family 2 towns over, the kind of project that took 6 weeks and 3 trades working in sequence, the kind of project I would have been laughed out of the room for quoting back when I was hand-lettering my own truck doors. We picked up 2 recurring commercial clients, a small property management company and a local dental office, who call us for every repair now without bothering to get a second bid, because 4 years of showing up on time and doing it right built something a marketing budget can't buy. When Sue turned that laptop around, I asked her, almost reflexively, to double-check the number, the way I used to double-check a wiring diagram before trusting it. She just smiled and said, I've checked it 3 times already. It's real, Tom. I drove home that day past the building where Trent's old staffing agency used to be. It's a nail salon now. I don't know what that means exactly, except that doors close and other doors open in their place, usually without asking anyone's permission first. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. Stories like this one, the kind that don't get told enough, about the people who get written off and decide to write their own ending anyway. That's exactly what we do here every single day. Now back to it. Because there's a part of this story I haven't told anyone outside my own kitchen table, and I think it matters more than the seven figures. About a year into the business, before any of the growth, before Marcus, before the second crew, I drove past the old Castor plant on my way to a job. I hadn't been down that road in months. The parking lot where I used to park for 22 years was half empty, the building itself quieter than I remembered, a few cars I didn't recognize scattered near the entrance. I pulled over, just for a minute, engine running, the way I had after Trent's office, the way I had on the day they handed me the box. I expected to feel angry. I'd earned the right to be angry. Instead, what I felt was something closer to gratitude, which surprised me enough that I sat there longer than I meant to. That plant taught me how to work. It taught me discipline. It taught me how to show up at 5 a.m. even on the days I didn't want to. It gave my family 22 good years. But it also, without meaning to, had convinced me that my worth was something handed to me by someone else's decision. A title, a badge, a folder with my name spelled wrong. And it took losing every bit of that to find out the worth had been mine all along. I just never had to prove it to myself before, because someone else had always been doing the deciding. I think about all the men and women I've met since who are sitting exactly where I sat outside that recruiting office. 50, 55, 60, hearing some version of too old from someone who has no idea what they're actually capable of. I think about the version of me in that garage, staring at a toolbox I was too afraid to open. I wish I could go back and tell him what I know now. The fear doesn't go away before you start. It goes away because you started anyway, badly, imperfectly, $1,800 underpriced, and bouncing checks and all. The starting is the whole thing. Everything after that is just learning. I didn't have a mentor for any of this. I didn't have a business degree or a cushion or a guarantee. What I had was a deck post that needed fixing, a neighbor willing to take a chance on me, and a wife who sat on cold concrete next to me at my lowest point and refused to let me believe the worst thing anyone had ever said about me. I've started keeping a short list, almost without meaning to, of people I've met since who remind me of myself in that garage. A woman at our church, 53, let go after 19 years at a call center, convinced she had nothing to offer outside that building. A man Gary introduced me to, 58, forced into early retirement from a job he loved, sitting at home feeling like a guest in his own life. I don't have a magic answer for either of them. I just tell them what Diane told me on cold concrete in a garage that smelled like sawdust and fear. The job was never the whole of you. It never was the whole of me either. It took losing it completely to actually believe that. These days, my truck still has Mitchell Home Solutions lettered across the doors, professional now, no longer crooked. But I kept the old one. It's parked behind the shop, paint faded, that first hand-lettered sign barely legible anymore. Marcus asked me once why I don't just scrap it for parts. I told him some things you keep around so you don't forget what you survived to get past. Jim still calls sometimes, not for work anymore, just to talk. The same neighbor whose sagging deck post started all of this on an ordinary Saturday morning I almost didn't say yes to. Diane still makes her coffee at home most mornings, not because we have to anymore, but because somewhere in those lean months, Simple stopped feeling like sacrifice and started feeling like who we are. Trent, the recruiter, has no idea any of this happened. I've thought about looking him up, sending him a number on a screen, proving a point. I never have. He wasn't wrong because he was cruel. He was wrong because he was guessing. The same way every closed door in your life is just someone else's guess about what you're capable of, dressed up as a fact. Jake works with me now, part-time around his own job, learning the business side this time instead of just learning to swing a hammer like I once did. Becca, 21 now and about to graduate, told me last month that watching what happened to our family rearranged what she's willing to settle for in her own career. I didn't set out to teach either one of them that lesson. I just stopped quitting long enough for them to notice. I don't know what door just closed on you. Maybe it was a job. Maybe it was a marriage, a diagnosis, a calendar that quietly turned a number you didn't ask for. I'm not going to tell you it gets easy, because it didn't for me, and I don't trust anyone who tells you it will. I'll just tell you this. The toolbox doesn't have to stay in the garage. It only stays there as long as you decide it does. If this story meant something to you, do 3 things for me. Follow this channel so you don't miss the next one. Share it with 5 people who need to hear it today, not someday, today. And leave me an honest comment, not a kind one, an honest one. Tell me what door closed on you and whether you've opened the garage yet. One more thing. Tell me what story you want to hear next. I'm listening.